Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we will be going over some of the Asian groups that made their way into the Caribbean. As many of you know, the Caribbean is many times considered the melting pot of the world, and part of the cultures that contributed toward this melting pot were Asian. So we'll just be going over some of the different groups and the countries that they went into. So we will begin talking about the Chinese. There were two main waves of Chinese migration into the Caribbean. The first wave consisted of indentured laborers who were brought primarily to Trinidad, British Guyana, and Cuba to work on the sugar plantations post-emancipation. The second wave were voluntary migrants that went to British Guyana, Jamaica, and Trinidad from the 1890s to the 1940s. Now, some interesting facts about the first versus second wave of Chinese that came to the Caribbean. With the indentured immigrants that came in the first wave, there occurred a lot of intermarriage with the existing ethnic groups. These immigrants were predominantly males, and many of them chose to marry and cohabit with the local Black and colored women. However, with the second wave of Chinese immigrants, especially those that came in the 20th century, they did not intermarry with other ethnic groups to the extent that the first wave did. And for them, it was a lot more common for a mail order Chinese bride to be chosen for them from China and brought to the Caribbean. In this way, the Chinese sought to reconstruct the Chinese family in the Caribbean. On the flip side, though, it was not uncommon for these single Chinese men to have children with African women before they married their Chinese wives. And so, having dual families, one Chinese and one Creole, became quite common, especially in places like Jamaica. So we will first begin with looking at the Chinese immigrants that came to Cuba. Chinese immigration to Cuba started in 1847 when Chinese contract workers, both Cantonese and Hakka, were brought to work in the sugar fields. In the following decades, many more workers from China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan were brought in order to replace or work alongside the Africans. There were also almost no women among the nearly entirely male Chinese population that migrated to Cuba, resulting in many Chinese men procreating and marrying with the Black, white, and mulatto women of Cuba. Havana's Chinatown is one of the oldest and largest Chinatowns in Latin America. The earliest ships of Chinese migrant workers arrived in Jamaica in 1854, the first directly from China and the second from Chinese migrants from Panama. The influx of Chinese workers aimed to replace the outlawed system of black slavery and entailed signing a 5-year contract that bound the laborers to specific planters and their estates, paying a wage of $4 for a 12-hour workday. Many Chinese immigrants would also arrive of their free will, independent of the indentured system. By 1932, 6,000 Chinese had immigrated to the island. Many of the Chinese would leave their plantation and open grocery stores known as Chinese shops everywhere across the island, and some credit them with being the pioneers of the chain stores across Jamaica. Chinese Jamaicans also left their prints on reggae. The record labels of Vincent Randy Chin and Leslie Jong Beverly would release the debut recordings of artists such as Bob Marley, Jimmy Cliff, and John Holt. Some notable Jamaicans of Chinese descent include Tyson Beckford, Horace Chang, Tsain Chin, and Clive Chin. The Chinese community in Trinidad and Tobago traces its origins to the year 1806, and it was the first organized settlement of Chinese people in the Caribbean. British officials, concerned in the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution, suggested that the settlements of Chinese immigrants in Trinidad and Tobago would provide a buffer between the enslaved Africans and whites. The abolition of slavery in the British Empire led to labor shortages in Trinidad, and so indentured laborers would be imported from various parts of the world, including additional workers from China as well as from India and Madeira. The Chinese community in the Dominican Republic is one of the largest Chinese communities in Latin America. There are estimates of approximately 60,000 people of Chinese origin living in the country. The first mention of a Chinese in DR was in 1864 during the Restoration War, with references to a man named Pancho el Chino who fought in the war. There were also reports of Chinese laborers brought over from Cuba to make bricks and quicklime in the Cibao region. A large influx of Chinese came during the American occupation of the DR in 1916 to 1924, as they sought to take part in the rapid economic expansion that resulted from the occupation. By the 1950s, Chinese Dominicans had established a small niche in the Duarte area of Santo Domingo, and most of the business in that area were Chinese owned. Santo Domingo officially inaugurated its own Chinatown in 2006, and within the past year, China and the Dominican Republic have also announced the establishment of formal diplomatic ties. And now we will move on to the Japanese. Japanese Caribbeans account for a smaller fraction of the Asian immigrants to the Caribbean, but a significant population of Japanese people and their descendants can be found in the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Jamaica. The Dominican Republic currently has the largest Japanese population in the Caribbean and Central American region, with most having settled in the areas of Constanza, Jarabacoa, and Dajabon. After World War II, many Japanese migrated to the Dominican Republic, which had made a treaty with Japan to open its doors to Japanese workers for agricultural labor. In 1956, an agreement between dictator Rafael Trujillo and Japan was formalized to bring Japanese immigrants into the country. The Dominican government was to provide the Japanese families with a furnished house, an acre of land, and 60 cents per day for each family member. The immigrants fared quite well initially. However, after civil war broke out in the DR in the 1960s, many left to other Latin American countries while others stayed, with many of their descendants still living in Constanza. The first Japanese arrived to Cuba in 1903, and in following decades, some would arrive from Mexico as they fled during the Mexican Revolution. They established agricultural societies in Carmelina, while others made it to the Isle of Youth, where some families established fruit and vegetable farms. On December 9, 1941, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Cuban President Batista declared war on Japan, and a few days later, all of the Japanese descendants living in Cuba were declared alien enemies, and many Japanese Cubans were seized. Some would be deported to the United States, and those that had been imprisoned would not be released until after the war ended. As of 2019, there are an estimated 1,200 Japanese descendants still living in Cuba. Now, briefly looking at immigrants from South Korea, Koreans have probably had the least amount of immigrants come to the Caribbean. However, there is a notable population in the Dominican Republic. DR and Korea established diplomatic ties in 1962, but it was not until the early 80s that the first Koreans began settling in DR. Korean migration to DR was a direct response of the Caribbean Basin Initiative. Koreans took advantage of this initiative and moved a handful of manufacturing and textile companies to DR as they received incentives from the Dominican government to open their factories and import machinery there. Koreans living in DR maintain close ties with their families and seldom socialize with the local Dominicans outside of the workplace. However, acculturation does seem to take place with the youth who do express interest in Dominican food, dance, and music. Now we will take a look at the massive Indian migration that made its way to the Caribbean. Indo-Caribbeans are people of South Asian descent who live in the Caribbean and are descendants of the Indian indentured workers brought over by the British, Dutch, and French during colonial ties. The countries with the highest populations of Indo-Caribbeans include Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname. Other countries with significant populations include Jamaica, Guadeloupe, Martinique, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, and Puerto Rico. Also, much of the curry recipes seen throughout the Caribbean can trace their origins to these South Asian immigrants. East Indians, or coolies as they used to be called, which is not considered offensive, were indentured servants brought to Trinidad and Tobago during the second half of the 19th century. They were brought over to work for 5 to 10 years on the sugar estates, replacing the former slaves of African ancestry who had begun to leave the plantations after the Emancipation Act in 1833. By the time the practice of indenture came to an end in 1920, 144,000 men and women had been brought from South Asia. The Indian influence is very noticeable in Trinidad and Tobago as they are one of the largest ethnic groups in the country. Hindu schools, Muslim schools, Indian groceries, and clothing stores are seen all over the countries. Many towns, avenues, and streets are also named after Indian cities and people. Diwali and Eid are also national holidays in Trinidad and Tobago. Many Indians would end up intermarrying with the Chinese and African locals on the island, thus creating a further mixed population. Indo-Guyanese were the largest ethnic group identified in the 2012 official census, totaling about 40% of the population. They were mainly taken from North India and brought as indentured laborers. Between 1835 and 1913, 341,600 Indians were imported into British Guyana. Owing to the relative shortage of women immigrants in the early days, many of the Indian men married or cohabited with African women, producing children of mixed blood referred to as Douglas. Sorry, I'm not sure how to say that. Living and working conditions on the plantations as laborers and engaging in intercaste, interreligious, and interracial marriage made it difficult to maintain ethnic exclusivity, and fusion of cultures would occur. The Indian presence was cemented into the country by the colonial administration's decision to establish exclusive land settlement schemes. To avoid paying the cost of these workers to return to India, the colonial system lured the immigrants into accepting land in lieu of the return passage. This perhaps was the most significant factor in the permanent settlement of Indians in Guyana. And lastly, we will look at Suriname, which is said to be one of the most ethnically diverse countries in the world. The Indo-Surinamese are descendants of the indentured workers brought by the Dutch and the British during the 19th century, and according to the 2012 census, they account for 27.4% of the population, making them the largest ethnic group in Suriname. These British Indians, as they were called, since India was at one point a colony of the British, had a reputation for being good farmers and hard workers. Even in those times, India was a large, densely populated country, and there was a large labor pool with little available farmland. In addition, India was becoming industrialized, and many traditional jobs were being eliminated. Many Indians were eager to immigrate because the caste system also put limitations on their activities. In all, about 34,000 Indian contract workers arrived in Suriname between 1873 and 1916. The majority were Hindu, but there were also Muslims as well. About one-third returned to India when their 5-year indenture was completed. Those choosing to remain were given land, a bonus from the government, and special loans to help them get started as farmers in their own right. In 1927, they became eligible for Dutch citizenship. And that concludes this here video, guys. I, of course, did not cover every single country that has Asian populations, but I did cover the ones with the largest Asian populations. So I hope that you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll check you guys in the next video. Bye!